This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Many of us have those stubborn pounds that seem impossible to lose, no matter how good we eat or how hard we work out. My solution is PlushCare. PlushCare is a leading telehealth provider with doctors who are there for you day and night to partner with you in your weight loss journey. They can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Plus, they accept most insurance plans. To get started, visit plushcare.com/weightloss. That's plushcare.com/weightloss.
Quality sleep is essential. That's why the Sleep Number Smart Bed is designed for your ever-evolving sleep needs. Need a bed that's firmer or softer on either side? Helps you sleep at a comfortable temperature? Sleep Number Smart Beds let you individualize your comfort, so you sleep better together. J.D. Power ranks Sleep Number number 1 in customer satisfaction with mattresses purchased in-store. And now, save 50% on the Sleep Number Limited Edition Smart Bed for a limited time. For J.D. Power 2023 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards. Only at a Sleep Number store or sleepnumber.com.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Food and class, inextricably linked here over the last millennia or so. But why is it still a thing now? This is the Food Programme, and I'm Sheila Dillon. In this edition, we've recruited Pen Vogler, author of Scoff, A History of Food and Class in Britain, and a group of the thoughtful to do some disentangling of a reality that's still damaging us. I hope it does some disentangling for you.
The next station is Oxton.
It's uncomfortable talking about it because in this job you get accused of being a middle-class chatterer. And of course, I am middle-class now. That's inevitable. But behind so many of the subjects that we investigate on the food programme, there is this class thing. It's a real barrier to people eating well and people thinking that that kind of food in some way isn't for them. I find that extraordinary, so it needs understanding.
Welcome to the Food Programme. I'm Sheila Dillon, and today in East London, on a journey to understand more about food and social class.
It's very complicated. You know, you'd like to be French or Italian or Spanish and not have to worry about these things where people aspire to eat the same kind of food. You can't all afford the same kind of food, but aspirations are the same. Notions of quality are the same. But we're not like that.
I can't promise you all the solutions. This quirk of ours has been going on for many centuries. But in this episode, we'll look at why these class markers exist, what impact they're having now, and if we can give them up, move away from something that's actually damaging. It's a story we start with a woman who knows the history of food as class, with visits to two places that always bring up serious questions of the social order. Then we'll move into the studio to talk to 5 people whose life experiences illuminate food and class. It's a programme of 2 halves. We start in London's East End, outside a pie, mash and eel shop, where we've arranged to meet food historian Pen Vogler, the author of Scoff, A History of Food and Class in Britain.
We have in Britain a particularly class-based way of kind of organising ourselves. And we've had that, I think, probably going back to 1066. And I don't want to blame the French for everything, but suddenly in 1066 we had a kind of dual class structure, you know, Normans at the top, Anglo-Saxons underneath. And those kind of hierarchies become embedded in the culture.
And that other moment of change, the Industrial Revolution.
People stopped being agricultural workers, people stopped producing their own food and became industrial workers. And this idea that you just need to pump calories into people to get them to stand at a machine all day. It doesn't matter what the quality is. It's all about quantity, not about quality. And I think that comes right from that change in our kind of sense of our country's self from that period.
It was during that time when places like this pie mash and eel shop started getting popular.
Is it all right if we share?
Yeah?
A large pie and mash and then a separate serving of jellied eels?
Yeah, sure. Large pie and mash with liquor.
In the end, we wimped out of jellied eels and opted for stewed ones, served warm in more of the parsley liquor. We also shared a large minced beef pie with mashed potatoes, a hearty meal and a nutritious one.
I think eel and pie shops come out of a change in social circumstances. So the one we've just been in, I think, was established in the 1860s, a real kind of Dickensian era when cities were really expanding. And so a lot of these shops, chop houses, pie shops, that kind of thing, are for people wanting to eat in the middle of the day. And in London, that would be called lunch. If you were in Leeds or Manchester, we would call that dinner, because dinner was always the biggest, most important meal in the day, whether it was served at kind of lunchtime or slightly later. Everything in Britain has a distinction, whether you drink ale or whether you drink wine, whether you have brown bread or whether you have white bread, whether you drink your tea out of a cup and saucer or a mug. We managed to make everything a kind of a distinction. And even when we sort of slightly fetishise things like fish and chips, we still like the idea that fish and chips is a kind of really working class meal, even though actually it's become a kind of seaside holiday activity. And so a lot of the foods that survive manage to kind of slip from one class into another. We give a status to particularly imported food. Avocado is a great example. Pineapple was the Victorian example. And we tend to kind of take status away or kind of be slightly sort of shifty about local working class, in inverted commas, kind of British foods. And I think eel and pie is probably slightly in that area at the moment.
The places where lots of working and middle class kids go now are chicken shops. Are chicken shops the eel and pie shops of this century?
Chicken shops are so interesting because 100 years ago, not that many people ate chicken. Chicken was an amazing treat. And obviously chicken has become industrialised, it's become very cheap. And in some ways, it's the eel and pie shops of today. But it's also American. And I do think it goes back to this idea that we give some kind of magical status to imported food that we don't give to our own food. And so burgers, McDonald's, KFC, for many people have a kind of status. It's something to aspire to.
The food we ate was pretty stodgy and it was sort of comfort food. Do you think that is one of the marks of what we've called working class food?
It's really interesting that pies and mash were the carbohydrates that you really needed because you needed padding, you needed filling up. And pies particularly have had a very, very long history. They're not just kind of working class in inverted commas. If you're talking in the 17th century about a venison pasty, that is something that you'd be proud to be serving. So yes, I think on the whole, there is this idea that plates of carbohydrate are what you give to labouring people. When those labouring people in the 17th century started to say, well, we'd quite like a cup of tea with our bread and cheese, there were all kinds of people like Samuel Johnson who were saying, no, that's not at all appropriate for you because it doesn't give you any calories. You need calories to work. I am an intellectual. I need the kind of lift that tea gives me for my kind of intellectual work, but you working classes, you don't need it.
I'd never come across that. I mean, Johnson actually said that. Yeah. How extraordinary.
Tea is actually on the menu at our next stop. But first, I wanted to get Pen's views on tea and class, because she writes a lot about that in her book, Scoff.
The time that you have it, what you call it, literally how you hold your cup, whether you put your milk in first, your milk in last. All that stuff around tea has been used historically to kind of distinguish me from you.
All right, now it's tea, afternoon tea. Let's go and distinguish, make judgments on each other. We're not going into one of the traditional tea places in London. We're going to this place called the Ivy Asia.
A hotel restaurant that's part of the very posh Ivy chain. It's on the first floor of one of those modern developer-built glass buildings that have turned our cities into Nowheresville. But this one overlooks a monument to place and beauty from another time, St. Paul's Cathedral.
This is the most extraordinary room, full of chinoiserie. It's got blossom, it's got bonsai, people wearing very vibrant colours. Actually, people have really dressed up to come here.
It was seriously busy, as you can hear, though most of the people around us were lingering over long Friday lunches, not afternoon tea.
The interesting thing about afternoon tea is it's been sort of slightly commodified, and you have a little stand, don't you? And the little stand always has little tiny, very sweet things on it, as well as a few tiny little sandwiches.
This is our afternoon tea. Vegetarian bao buns, salmon and avocado maki rolls, duck spring rolls, prawn dumplings, mushroom gyozas with hoisin sauce. At the top you have raspberry...
I love the fact that afternoon tea, even in a kind of Asian variation of it, comes with a hierarchy.
While we were waiting for it to arrive, you were saying afternoon tea has always been an aspirational meal.
I think the class associations around afternoon tea still come from that kind of country house ideal. And yet at the same time it was developing its own kind of parallel career as the fuel for workers, you know, because that caffeine, and you could get some sugar into it. And increasingly, as Britain needed its workers to just stay awake and stay alive in front of their machines and all the rest of it, tea was kind of welcomed as a way of doing that, and particularly tea and sugar. And that became a class indicator.
We could talk entirely about food and class through afternoon tea, couldn't we? But does money enter into it, you know, the cost of that?
It's a really complicated mixture of things, but it's fundamentally about the supply and demand curve. So it's about scarcity. And if money is scarce, then expensive food obviously has a kind of status. But also the things that are scarce in our urban lives, like space, gardens, place to grow your own food, time to cook for yourself, all those things, they acquire a kind of aura of kind of status around them.
Afternoon tea at the Ivy Asia with Pen Vogler and producer Natalie Donovan. But let's widen the story. Why does any of this matter now? I think it's because it's still tied up with what we feel is food for us. Unlike Italians or Spaniards or Greeks, we don't in Britain all aspire to eat the same quality food. Millions of poor people eat poor food, industrial food, that's now making them chronically sick on a scale we've not seen before. Nearly 40% of women in economically hard-pressed areas are obese, compared to around 20% in prosperous areas. Chronic sickness follows the same pattern. Class, when it comes to food, is killing us.
We've come back into the studio to talk this through some more, and we want to think about how class and food impacts our lives now. Why is it still a thing in 2024? Joining me are a bunch of remarkable people. Some I know and have interviewed before, and some I haven't. On my right is Kathleen Kerridge, and I'm describing you as a food campaigner, Kathleen, because you just came back from the House of Lords giving evidence to a committee looking at food, obesity and diet.
I did, yeah. I'd agree that mostly I'm now a food campaigner rather than anything else, I suppose.
Well, a very effective food campaigner. Nathan Smith is a chef who has 1.1 million followers on TikTok, and whose first book, Flavorful, has just been published. Anna Taylor is head of the charity The Food Foundation. And then we have William Sitwell, who is a food writer, a broadcaster, a restaurant critic, and a judge on MasterChef. And on the line, we're all gathered in a London studio, but on the line from BBC Sheffield is Dr. Maxine Woolhouse, a senior psychology lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, and her research interests are in food and class and gender. Let me just, to begin, what class would you say you are, Kathleen?
I would say born into middle class, but financial has definitely taken us down to the working classes if we've got to place us somewhere. When you're talking about class, especially in sociology or anything, there's a lot more that goes into it rather than just the financial aspect. So middle working class, somewhere in the middle.
Complex.
Yes.
Anna, you run a charity. You must be middle class.
Yeah, I think I'm safely middle class, really. My dad came from a working class background, but then set up his own business and, moved into the middle classes. But my mum's dad was a banker, so I think they were in the middle classes, and I was born into that.
You're
Very
all mixed
fortunate.
up. Nathan, what about you?
I was born into working class, and I think I'm still within that class, but slightly on the cusp of middle class.
What makes you say that you're on the cusp of middle class?
Because growing up working class, I definitely know how things were and how I couldn't just get what I wanted when I wanted it. But like today, if I wanted to go on holiday, I can go on holiday, and I think that's a luxury that you would have when you're in middle class. Also, how financially stable are you for like the next year? Those are things that I would say fall into the middle class structure.
William, you have a famous name, William Sitwell. You can't escape your upper class background, can you?
Haven't you already asked me this? Didn't I do this? It's the most awkward question I can possibly think of. I'm working class. My family made their fortune in nails in the early part of the 18th century, and coal mining. So that's where I come from. I suppose you could say that over the years, the odd large house has been added on, and the odd title, and then obviously, we lose all that and have to sell all our smart paintings, and like most of the posh upper classes, we're left in relative penury. So it's not a question I like to answer because I find it quite awkward.
Well, I think, isn't it awkward for any of us answering those questions?
Probably. I think it's sort of makes you squirm, because also it's not, if Britain is riven with class structure, people who are part of those class structures find it very, very awkward to talk about.
Maxine, what class do you belong to?
I'd say I come from aspirational working class parents, and now there are certain aspects of my life that are very middle class, but I also have gaps in my cultural knowledge that for me marks me out as not having come from a middle class background.
I think what you've all really just explained is the complexity of class in Britain, because I'd say I come from a rural working class background, but I'm clearly middle class now.
And you spend your life talking about food. How middle class is that?
How middle? Well, one of the things that really, it's a question for you all really, is that one of the problems I find in Britain is that we have a large chunk of the population eating food which is driving them into ill health. Before we started our recording, Kathleen, you were talking about small children going into primary school already obese and already on this downward slope. But if you try and talk in the UK about helping people to eat more quality food, you get accused of middle-class chattering. And you think, why do we have to close down discussions like that?
One of the reasons we have this issue is because as a country we're quite late to the party of thinking that food is a reasonable, decent cultural topic of conversation. And I think it's partly because historically we moved from agrarian to industrial revolution, city-dwelling excitement as a society very quickly, and we lost a lot of our agrarian seasonal roots, where I think a lot of Europeans didn't. It's literally only been since sort of the late 80s, 1990s, shows like MasterChef that made it acceptable for people to talk about food rather than golf or business or the weather or politics at the table. So we're kind of playing catch-up, I think, with some of our kind of European friends.
Maxine, you're listening to this. What's your reaction?
I think another aspect to this is that what we eat and our kind of food and eating practices are tightly bound up with our class identities. If we kind of put money aside, we still wouldn't all choose to eat the foods that are regarded as, fine cuisine, nutritionally dense. So I think it kind of muddies the water, and often when you hear policymakers, and I think really well-meaning policymakers, talk about food poverty and everything, it isn't just about money. It is very much about our identities as well. I did some focus groups with teenage girls and predominantly working class girls, and something that came out of that was that they associated what they called healthy food with posh girls. That's how they termed it. They didn't necessarily mean healthy food. They conflated healthy food with low-calorie food, so things like lettuce and the kinds of foods people might eat if they're on a diet or something. It was the posh girls that eat those kinds of foods, and they felt like it was somehow pretentious because the foods that they associated with good food were more hearty and filling, more like carbohydrates and so on, which again, that's well known that working class people traditionally do eat more filling foods like carbs and high fat foods, out of necessity, because first and foremost, if you haven't got a great deal of money, that's what you're going to be concerned with.
Right, and as we heard from Pen Vogler, and I think William said the same thing, that, there's the history from the Industrial Revolution of, calories being just fed to people in the factories, cheapest calories possible. And you still see that, don't you still see that happening? I mean, when Margaret Thatcher and their government wiped out nutritional standards for school meals, and that seemed to show that nothing mattered about the food beyond the calories. Mm-hmm. And that was in the 1980s, in the lifetime of some of us around this table.
Since you're bringing up school food, it's one of the places where differences between children, linked at least to their income, are very evident, because you've got the children that are eligible for free school meals, you've got the children who might be eligible but their families don't want to take them up because that's not for them or for other good reasons. Then there are the children who are too poor to afford paid meals, who are on really poor quality packed lunches. And then the children who don't need to worry about how much they spend on their card because mum and dad can afford it. And you see where they sit, how they interact with one. It's all marking those divisions within a school canteen.
Kathleen?
I absolutely agree. It starts so young, the divisions that we actually have around food. But also from another perspective, when you educate yourself about food and you become a foodie and you enjoy cooking and things are happening from scratch, if you are from a predominantly working class background where things are carb heavy or maybe oven foods, frozen chips, that sort of thing, it's very unusual to have someone cooking completely from scratch, and it shifts you slightly out of your own class and culture, if that makes any sense to you.
I mean, just from what you've said before the broadcast, it seems like you suffer from a kind of reverse snobbery. You were saying that your working class friends think you're being somewhat snobbish to cook from raw ingredients.
But I have a lot of health problems, the biggest one being a heart condition. So I tend to look after myself the best I can, and to me that means no ultra-processed foods. I don't have the fish fingers and chips and beans. I don't have the pie and mash. And as a result, even though they jokingly call me a snob and laugh, oh, you're posh and everything, they all come round on a Friday to be fed. So it's taken in the way it's meant, which is friendly banter. They're not bullying me. They're not like, oh, yeah, you think you're too good for us or anything like that. But it very much does mark the division between what I eat, what my children eat, what I would feed my grandson, to what I find in other people's fridges and freezers, and I don't recognise as food anymore. So it's...
Yeah. I mean, Nathan, you are 27. I mean, there you are with 1.1 million TikTok followers. You are teaching them to cook from scratch. Do you get kickback from that? This is snobbish in some way, or beyond the reach of your followers?
I don't think, no, I don't get kickback. I think people really just want to learn because they've come to look for a lasagna recipe. So you can't complain that you've come to look for this. But yeah, people don't really kick back. But I think it's because it's also the way you do it.
But you're teaching them to cook in a way that you're saying, to quote your, that you're flavorful, that you're talking about flavorful, delicious, exciting food. You don't go on about healthiness.
No, I don't. I've always touched on this. I don't believe in counting calories. I think it's so restrictive. It removes the fun from food. I always tell people just eat with moderation, but don't restrict yourself. I'm not gonna just not use butter because it's got 200 calories in it. That's never gonna be the way I cook, because food for me it's meant to be enjoyed.
Just this question of this healthy eating, how disastrous this has been, I think. I mean, I remember once going to look at the free fruit program at a primary school. The box of apples came in, and they were just terrible, tasteless apples. And I thought, I don't want to eat this. I mean, why would I want to eat this? It doesn't taste nice. I'd rather have a bag of Walker's crisps. And that's how we all are, isn't it? But the problem is the apple gets identified as healthy. The Walker's crisps, or any crisps, get identified as unhealthy, and we start to think in these categories. Whereas if we look at Spain and France and Greece and Italy, the healthiest developed nations on earth, they eat for pleasure. People have aspirations roughly to eating the same things, and yet here we are in this absurdity.
And I think some of those other countries have done a better job of protecting their food culture. So one stat I was looking at in terms of fast food outlets, in Britain we have one for every 1,200 people, and in Spain it's one for every 3,000 people. And I think you could see that in a number of different metrics in different countries where they've done a better job than we've done in protecting that more traditional food culture.
Could I say something about that?
Maxine, yes.
Yeah, when my children were young, I lived in Japan for 2 or 3 years, and my eldest son went to the local elementary school. I mean, the food culture was just so different. For example, in schools, nobody takes a packed lunch. They all get a school dinner, and there is only one thing on the menu. My son at that time, I think he was 6 when we went there, he was terrible at eating vegetables, and so you can imagine it was a big shock to him to suddenly go into school where he didn't have a choice. He just had to eat what was on the menu, which was generally things like fish, vegetables, rice, just really good food. And of course, after a period of time, he just ate what everybody else was eating and began to really enjoy it. And then in school, food was part of the curriculum. They would grow. I remember them growing sweet potatoes and then having a kind of barbecue where they cooked and ate them. And just going back to the damage that healthy eating discourse does, I think food should be enjoyable and not categorising food into healthy, not healthy, and so on. I think it's really detrimental to people.
I completely agree with you. It's like the government's calorie counting on restaurant menus. I mean, it's so regressive. We need calories. And to label a calorie as something you should avoid, to me, seems to be completely insane.
Nathan, your parents are from Jamaica, and I think you've gone back to Jamaica quite a lot. Would you say that there is a better relationship with food in Jamaica?
I would say it's probably quite similar to in Japan, in the sense of like when you're a child, you get what you're given. But that was kind of translated over here to me as well. So as a child, I wouldn't be like, oh, I'm not going to eat this. Like, no, that's your dinner. So I think, in Jamaica, it's very similar to that. But also we live off the land. So all the exotic fruit that people have here, that just grows on trees for people to pick. For example, like ackee, I think it's like £5 a tin for ackee here. That just grows on trees by the roadside. It belongs to nobody, and people can just take that. So in Jamaica, it's a lot easier for people to just give their children what they need to eat because they're just going to take it.
The class differences in Jamaica are people eat out if you have lots of money, but you're saying that basically aspirations are much the same whether you can afford to go to a restaurant or not.
It would be people eat out, but also it depends on the cuts of meat you get. So, for example, like chicken back. So when a chicken's broke down, a butcher doesn't do anything for the back, but that's what people buy, chicken back. Chicken foot soup, those are the things that people eat. So there's definitely like a class difference because someone from a higher class definitely wouldn't indulge in chicken foot soup, but maybe for like nostalgia purposes, like there's soups that I have just because like I used to have it with my grandparents and it's nice to have. So yeah, there's definitely a class difference in Jamaica and the types of food that you have.
Kathleen and Anna, thinking about what Maxine's just said about her experience of Japan, did either of you have experiences abroad that illuminated what was going on in Britain?
What I was thinking was I grew up in a circle of other girls whose mothers were single mums. So everything was very much on a budget. But our mums were never indoors to cook for us. There was no one at home. Our food came out of the freezer. We made do because our mums were out at work. And without home economic lessons in school, and with no clue of what we were doing and pretty much left to raise ourselves, late 80s, early 90s, we lost a lot of our food culture, if you will, because a huge proportion of women did become divorced over that time. They were single parents over that time. There were a lot of factors that were going in that broke down what we perceive food to be, and I think that's where it's become very middle class now, because if you do have mum at home cooking the food and you're getting fresh food and it's being served on plates around a table, that's very unusual now in our culture.
Let's move on to the food industry. How you think the food industry uses social class to sell to us. And Maxine, you said that you saw marks of class in ads for ultra-processed food, television ads. What were you talking about?
Yeah, I think, when you see all the adverts for the fast food delivery companies, etc., and, fast food chains, I do think that it tends to be working class people who are depicted in the adverts, because they know that those kinds of foods tend to fit in with the cultural world that they inhabit. So, for example, that those foods will be familiar to them, and also that they are relatively cheap, not all of them, but relatively cheap. I think ultimately it's the detriment to people's health. I have a big issue with the food industry and the fast food takeaway industry.
Anna, you've seen this too.
Yeah, I think what's interesting when you look at the nutrition stats, the really big differences between at least income levels, so rather than class, but assuming that those are broadly correlated, the big differences are on the good food. So it's fruit and veg, fibre, oily fish, the sort of three big ticket items for improving our health. That's where you see the really big differences between rich and poor people in Britain. It's less so actually on the really bad nutrients. And I think we've got a lot of conversations going on about these very unhealthy foods, but we're not really having a conversation about how you actually get people excited about eating some of these better foods and how you enable that to happen if you've not got much money.
What about you, Nathan? What would you say?
You need to show them how to do it. That's the way you get them excited. Like, you can't say, oh yeah, you need to eat more oily fish, but what is oily fish to me if you're not telling me an end product? It needs to be believable as well. Like, there's no point showing someone how to make something and it doesn't even look like it would taste nice. I was going to say something that, like, none of us have actually mentioned is time. Like, time is a luxury. It's all well and good showing people how to cook something, but if they're working 2 jobs, they don't have the time. They're tired, they're exhausted, they're coming home from working 12 hours. They don't have the time to even want to cook for 30 minutes. They want to come home and sleep and recoup for the day. And that's just thinking about if someone was a single person. When you add children into the equation, it becomes a whole different ballgame. And that's not even a ballgame that I would understand because I don't have any children. So I think it's easy to kind of pass judgment for some people and say like, oh, well, we can show them how to do this and we can show them how to do that. But if they don't have the time, they can't do it. And I think a lot of people forget as well, we are in a recession. So people are taking up second jobs. If you don't have the time, you actually can't even implement all this information that you have.
Yeah. William, before we started recording, you were saying that you were in the United States and you were looking at how they use this link between class and food.
There was a supermarket brand who deliberately targeted their points privilege system at low-income people. And I remember going to this sort of lab store, and they had this huge, great area where if you bought items from that area, you would get more points. And the shocking thing was it was just filled with edible substances, stuff that, I wouldn't feed my children. But they saw that that was a way of ingratiating themselves to that kind of demographic. I was editing a magazine for Waitrose at the time, and they were doing literally the opposite of things that we were trying to talk about over here in the UK.
We have some similar practices here in terms of the multi-buys being focused on the expandable categories, as they call it in the industries. So there are some aspects of that we see here in terms of how promotions work.
Could I just say something about that?
Yeah, Maxine. Yeah.
I've got a student at the moment doing a research project, and she's interviewed mums about packed lunches and what they put in the child's packed lunch. And one of the she was a single working class mum, brought along a photograph of a typical packed lunch that she gave her child. And they were kind of all branded items, like a branded chocolate biscuit and so on. And when the student asked the participant about the packed lunch, the participant explained that money was tight, and what she did was she bought branded items because she didn't want her child to be teased or looked down upon at school. So the point is that working class people are often quite concerned with brands because it's aspirational and it's a form of saying, look, I'm not poor.
It's really funny that this has come up again because, excuse me, it came up at the House of Lords committee taking evidence on food insecurity and obesity. And one of the big points that I found when mine were at school is the amount of bullying that happens if a lunchbox is opened and you've got a Smart Price packet of crisps. It immediately marks your child out.
It used to happen to me. I used to have packed lunches, and obviously I didn't always have a lot of money, so sometimes I would have own brand things, and I would just not want to eat my packed lunch. I would literally just go and rush and get my sandwich sneakily and then eat the rest on my way back. Or sometimes I wouldn't even eat my packed lunch sometimes. So these are little things, and when it's happening to you as a child, of course it's going to be embedded in you.
And also, I then went the other route and I was like, OK, we'll do from scratch lunches, pasta salads, rice salads, all of that. And then they were bullied because they had weird food and it smelt funny. So it was, it has to be Walker's Crisps, a Penguin Bar, a Froob. It's got to have that name and the character on it.
The fact that a lunchbox, reflects all these class anxieties. I mean, all of you have been really brilliant at picturing the problem. But we started to make this programme because we'd reached a point in 2024 where these class links, are just really obviously damaging, that ill health is growing, etc., etc. So on our afternoon out in East London, we also stopped at a place we thought might be one of those levellers, a community garden in Hoxton called the Growing Kitchen. It's been going now for 15 years.
So this bit here that we're standing in is the communal area. We have 40 microplots, pizza oven, a barbecue, picnic area, 2 sheltered areas.
Tony, the chairman, is giving us a tour.
This is the foraging area, and we will plant this area out for communal foraging. That means that anybody who's about can forage in this area.
I asked him who uses the garden, mostly people from the council flats around the garden or from the wider community, and does class come into it?
I don't tend to think of people as being middle class, upper class, working class. There are professionals here, there are non-professionals here. The professionals and non-professionals have more or less the same aspirations now. We have about 15, 20 people turn up to meetings to make decisions. And they tend to agree mostly because there's a common ethos in here which exists across the class. They want to be outside, they want to have a community, they want a place to grow food, they want a place to eat. They just want to enjoy one another's company without, I'm a banker and, I'm a bus driver, They want that.
Then we were joined by Carmel, another member of the Growing Kitchen.
I work with families and they don't have gardens. So on a Tuesday or Wednesday morning, this is our space. And they chop up the vegetables, we wash them here, chop them up. So, they very much get involved. It's one big community, isn't it, Tony?
We have 3 Muslim women come here, and I've got to admit, I've learned so much from them. About, how they fit into their own culture. They've broken down all my stereotypes. And if we didn't have the garden, we wouldn't have that range of community. We'd all be stuck in our little pens at home and down the pub, places where a lot of these groups would normally meet.
Both Tony from Birmingham and Carmel, a local, had eaten very simple food as children, meals that some people might describe as typically working class.
Well, my parents are Irish, so it was a lot of boiled bacon, cabbage and potatoes, mashed potatoes, sausages. We didn't have chips because, unless we brought them from the chippy, we didn't traditionally make them at home. I suppose most of the food we had would be what most people of our class had back then, non-processed, seasonal food. We didn't have things like strawberries. Cheese was very expensive. Eggs were very expensive. Always potatoes. No rice, no pasta back in those days.
Carmel, are you from this area?
I'm an Islington girl.
What were the foods you grew up on?
Very much the same as Tony. My parents were Irish. Boiled bacon and cabbage, liver and mashed potato. Breakfast, it wouldn't be serious, it would be boiled eggs for breakfast, boiled egg and soldiers. So there was no boxes. There was no boxes. It was all homegrown and bought from the local shop on the day. Now and again we'd go and get pie and mash. It'd usually be when my dad got paid. We like a fish and chip Friday, but we'd go out to the pie and mash shop. Yeah, great times, yeah.
Carmel and Tony from the Growing Kitchen in Hoxton, East London.
And there are many examples of places like the community garden in Hoxton where class differences don't seem to exist. We've featured many in past editions of the food programme. Some have been featured in our annual celebration of all that's great and life-changing, the BBC Food and Farming Awards. But how do we take it further? Back to my expert panel in the studio.
There's too many factors at play. Like, people need more money. But how do you give people more money? There's too many variables that influence how we could actually shut this down, unfortunately.
One of the very obvious places, in my view, where you start is at school, and you just make school lunch part of the school day that everybody participates in. You have a narrow menu and everybody eats it together and it's free for everyone. It's just part of being at school. Of course, it costs money, which is the sticking point.
Kathleen, what would you do?
I think that definitely needs to go back to schools, but also good old home economics. Let the children play with food, not be afraid of waste, because especially in the poorest households, they don't get the chance to do that at all, because if they don't like it, that food will be thrown away and there is no bigger crime.
And we're talking primaries, beginning in primary. Maxine, what's your view?
I mean, in an ideal world, I think, do away with packed lunches. Everybody has a school dinner, and stop labelling foods as healthy, not healthy, good, bad, etc. But I also, again, agree with Nathan in terms of a lot of this also comes down to deep economic inequalities. Fixing those would also be a very good starting point.
Thank you all very much. I mean, that's an illumination of the problem, but also some sense of what we need to do.
We contacted the Department for Education in England about this. Their press office told us the department is committed to make sure young people eat healthily, and schools are mandated to ensure children are provided with healthy food and drink options across the school day. The department also says it's investing £200,000 to pilot new training for school governors to improve food policies.
Do you think this government or the next one is ready to take food seriously?
No, absolutely not. It is absolutely nowhere near the agenda of either this government or whatever the next government is going to be.
It's definitely not this government, because you shouldn't have a footballer campaigning for free school meals.
Anna?
I agree, but I do think the economic problems linked to the huge numbers of economically inactive sick people that we have in Britain, I think is going to open up the conversation a bit. Policymakers have to act. Exactly.
Unignorable.
I think one becomes a massive treasury issue, there's a financial issue. That's when you're stirred into action through massive crisis. So we might get there.
Yeah. Well, here's hoping. Well, that's it. Our time is up. So thank you all. Nathan Smith, William Sitwell, Anna Taylor, Kathleen Kerridge, Dr. Maxine Woolhouse, Pen Vogler, and all those at the Growing Kitchen, the community garden in Hoxton. Thank you all very much. Thanks for listening. Producer Natalie Donovan and I had to do some thinking about our own attitudes to food, what's for us and what's not, in making this programme. We hope you enjoyed it.
I'm Alex Krotowski.
And I'm Kevin Fong.
How do you feel about AI?
Does it scare you?
Very quickly that question comes up. Is it going to think for us?
Does it excite you?
I say, how is the AI going to help us to think better?
Do you worry about how it'll change your life, your job, your kids?
AI is built into many of the software applications that we now use in the schools every day.
In every episode of The Artificial Human from BBC Radio 4, Kevin and I are here to help. We will chart a course through the world of AI, and we will answer your questions.
It doesn't just lie, but it lies in an incredibly enthusiastic, convincing way. That ability to be able to kind of think critically is just going to be so important as we move forwards.
The Artificial Human with me, Alex Krotowski.
And me, Kevin Fong.
Listen on BBC Sounds.
Hi, I'm Daniel, founder of Pretty Litter. Cats and cat owners deserve better than any old-fashioned litter. That's why I teamed up with scientists and veterinarians to create Pretty Litter. Its innovative crystal formula has superior odor control and weighs up to 80% less than clay litter. Pretty Litter even monitors health by changing colors to help detect early signs of potential illness. It's the world's smartest kitty litter.
Go to prettylitter.com and use code ACAST for 20% off your first order and a free cat toy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.